Welcome to today's webinar, Decarbonizing NYC, Understanding the All-Electric New Buildings Law. 3 quick housekeeping items before we get started today. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded so we can post it online after the event. We'll send out a recording link later today. Second, all attendees today will be muted throughout the event. If you have questions for our speakers during the training, please direct your questions to the chat box on the right side of your screen. Third, and finally, if you would like to be put in contact with an NYC Accelerator account manager after today's webinar, please fill out a form after the webinar. I will put the link in the chat in just a moment. So today's speakers, we will hear from Sonal Jessel, Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice, Sean Brennan, Director of Research at Urban Green Council, Nicole Abeen, Deputy Director for Legislative Affairs at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, and we will hear from Mike Berry, the new Buildings Manager for NYC Accelerator. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sonal for opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Sonal Jessel. I'm the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. You can move to the next slide. Just a quick overview. We Act is a community-based organization based in West Harlem. We've been an organization since 1988, and we started from direct action and community organizing against the sewage treatment plant pictured here that was being placed in the west side of Harlem, a neighborhood that was already plagued with a number of toxic facilities and air quality issues. And so the community was being impacted by cumulative impact of a lot of toxic pollutants that hurt their health. And so we got started by organizing against this. And now we do policy advocacy on the city, state, and national level. And we do community organizing and programming with Northern Manhattan neighborhoods of Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood. You can move to the next slide. So I am here just to give a couple minutes on why all electric buildings, why we advocated for this law to pass, and why this is important to us. So we were one of the leading groups to advocate for the All Electric Buildings Act for New York City. And we did this with New York Communities for Change and NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group, and Food and Water Watch, and lots and lots of other advocates and experts and research institutions and consultants and industry professionals who wanted to see this move forward. Our investment is that as an organization, we believe in environmental justice, which is the idea that everyone deserves to live in a healthy community where they can live, work, play, and pray. And particularly what we are trying to do is interrupt the line between environmental racism, which creates environmental health impacts. And now we're at a place in the world where climate change and the climate crisis has gotten to such a bad level where we are seeing those direct health impacts and economic impacts and just general security impacts on people that live in communities of color and low income in New York City. And then COVID-19, of course, did not help and made matters much, much, much worse. So we advocate for healthy housing, which is just generally that everyone deserves a healthy and safe home. And that was our big motivator for why we wanted to see this bill move forward. We believe that going electric and electrifying buildings leads everyone to have a healthy and safe home. So you can go to the next slide. Some of the main pieces of healthy housing is lead, housing free of lead, housing free of mold, asbestos, pests, clean water, and in this case, energy security, which if you go to the next slide, is essentially the idea that every tenant or homeowner can afford their utility bills, which is a big discussion now, that they have thermal comfort, so their house is adequately hot or adequately cold in the right times, that there aren't toxic air pollutants that are hurting health and leading to respiratory illness, cardiovascular illness, cancers, all sorts of health issues, and that we're not using fossil fuels anymore because we know that that's what's contributing to the climate crisis and leading to all sorts of extreme weather events. And now we're talking about it geopolitically in a way that really puts people at risk. So next slide. We wanted to see the Electric Buildings Act move forward because we were concerned about indoor air quality. It's one of the biggest things we work on as an environmental justice organization. The EPA says that 90% of people spend 90% of their time indoors, yet they do not regulate indoor air quality. And we know that there's a lot of indoor air pollutants that can be really, really potent, especially if people are, they're sitting in an enclosed space with those air pollution. Next. And that is not impacting people equally. So we see low-income communities, particularly households that are households of color, are exposed to a lot more indoor air pollutants due to long-term disinvestment in housing or affordability of better quality housing, whatever it might be. You have people that live in smaller sizes, smaller houses, there's more people living in there, so crowding is really common. And then inadequate ventilation in homes, especially with regards to using a stove. So next slide. Just a couple of stats here. Gas stoves is something that we wanted to see switched out in homes, and that's part of the important process of electrifying a building, is how do we electrify all of the things that we use in homes that might otherwise contribute to health impacts. So gas stoves, we know, are full of air pollutants. 50% of homes with gas stoves have 400% higher average indoor air pollutants than homes with electric stoves. So we know that there's something going on there when it comes to health. We know that 55 to 70% of homes with gas stoves without ventilation experience indoor air qualities that would be considered illegal if they were at those levels outdoors. So we know that it's unsafe levels. Next. And a recent study came out that found that it only takes a few minutes for the levels of nitrous oxide to pass a safe level once it's turned on. And stoves also lead to methane emissions even when they're off. And so we know that NO2 is a toxic pollutant that hurts health. So we have a huge investment in seeing the all-electric buildings move forward, not only to fight climate change, but to create healthy indoor homes for people. Next slide. You can skip this one. Thank you. So just to conclude, why do we care about Gas-Free NYC, which is the push for the All Electric Buildings Act in New York City? It's because of this air quality improvement. But secondly, it's because we're mitigating the climate crisis. We're getting off fossil fuels. The next is because there are job opportunities for electrification and growing that field. So the more that buildings are having to go electric, the more opportunity there is for good jobs. And then the last is pushing technological advancements forward. If the city has to be creating buildings that are becoming electric, then how are we making sure that we have the technology for it? There's a lot of discussion about what buildings are ready and not ready for becoming all electric, and putting this, now having this bill on the books saying in a couple of years, different buildings of different sizes need to start building electric, that the industry is going to prepare for it because they have to, and because it's already in process. So these are some of the big reasons why we were pushing Gas-Free NYC, and we were really excited to see it moving forward, and looking forward to seeing how all of New York City can live in healthy housing. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Sonal. That was a great high-level overview of all the benefits of electrification. My name is Sean Brennan. I'm the Director of Research at Urban Green Council. So today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the logistics of electrification and the research that we've done over the last 3 years. So next slide. So I'm going to touch on why all electric buildings are important beyond some of the amazing co-benefits that were already covered. And then I'll talk a little bit about, how much and will they reduce carbon emissions for a building or citywide. And then the big question that we just answered recently was, can the local grid really accommodate this extra demand? And then finally, I'll just touch on which buildings we think could start electrifying now and where we might see winter peaks first in New York City. Next slide. All right, so why are all electric buildings so important? I would assume most of this group knows that 2/3 of New York City's emissions actually come from buildings today. That's about evenly split between the mid-size and large buildings versus the smaller 1 to 4 family buildings. So the big purple box is everything above 25,000 square feet. So that's everything affected by Local Law 97. And then the last third is transportation and waste and streetlights. So this really highlights why, as opposed to a lot of other cities, why we have to focus on finding a path to cleaner buildings. So next slide. So we've made a lot of progress over the last decade. Emissions are way down. A big part of that was actually a successful policy called the Clean Heat Program. That phased out heavy fuel oil in 2015. So nearly all of the number 5 and 6 fuel oil is now gone. But you can see that gas has almost doubled. So it's about half of our energy use now in New York City's buildings. So it is the dominant force. It's been cheap. It's been a lot cleaner than fuel oil. And energy efficiency programs have really been targeting electricity. So that yellow band has actually fallen over the last decade while gas has taken over. So next slide. So a big component of the growth in gas use has been new construction, right? And that's what this law is really targeted at. So let's quantify what we mean by new construction and how much that might mean. So over the last decade, between 1,000 and 3,000 new buildings are built each year in New York City. And so that's between 35 and 45 million square feet. And obviously we're talking about averages here. There's a lot of volatility in this market. And most of it is single family homes, but there are about 200 new high rises built in New York City every year. And you can see some of that data on the big buildings that REBNY now tracks as part of their quarterly construction report. So pretty cool data you can check out at the link as well. Next slide. All right, so we talked a little bit about the landscape of buildings in New York City. Now I'm going to go into some of our detailed information on how we're going to do this. So we published Going Electric in 2020. That was focused on how we're going to retrofit multifamily buildings. And then in December 2021, we published Grid Ready, which is all about, is Con Edison's local grid ready for this change? Next slide. So to start off, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with beneficial electrification. So we're talking about heat pumps, and heat pumps are just air conditioners that work in both directions. And even in winter, there is outside air that has heat that can be pulled inside, and that's enough heat to warm your home, even when it's cold outside. So that's opposed to something like thermal resistance or electric resistance heating, which is similar to a toaster oven, where you're just exchanging 1 unit of electricity for 1 unit of heat. But heat pumps actually have the ability to take 1 unit of electricity and turn it into 3 units of heat. Next slide. So it's a big difference, but how much is this going to cost? So this is pretty new information that's on the slide. We don't have a lot of examples of all electric buildings in New York, but some of the best information comes from NYSERDA's competition called the Buildings of Excellence competition. So all of this data is public. They've already completed 2 rounds of winners, and the second round of winners was actually exclusively all electric. So they've published this cost data. You can go check it out on their website. But it looks like the incremental cost per square foot are going to add about 6% to new construction in New York City and about 7% in upstate New York. So they're pretty different, mostly because of the geographies there. But then if you layer in incentives, the extra cost in New York City is just 3%, and then it's about equivalent for building in the rest of New York State, all electric versus traditional construction. So it's including everything from heat pumps for heating, domestic hot water heat pumps, as well as electric appliances for cooking. So that's a big difference from the next slide that you'll see. We also collected data as part of the Going Electric report to figure out how much the retrofits would cost. So these are going to be a lot more expensive, and these numbers are only looking at the heat pumps that are used for heating. So if I was to replace steam radiators with heat pumps. And so we think it's going to be between $13 and $21 per square foot to do these retrofits. These are going to be much more costly than doing new construction, mostly because of all the invasiveness involved in putting in new equipment, relocating tenants during the retrofit. Next slide. So next question that we heard a lot was about whether or not heat pumps are actually going to reduce emissions in New York. And it's a good question because a lot of our electricity obviously comes from fossil fuels. So the answer is yes, they'll certainly cut carbon. If you look at the grid, what I've shown is heat pump performance or coefficient of performance along the horizontal axis. And then the vertical axis shows us the fossil fuel system efficiency. So each one of those dots is a scenario that we're going to either save or have additional carbon depending on what the building had before. So you can see in all these cases, every green check is a scenario where we're actually going to cut carbon. And this is in 2030. So the grid has taken up more renewables. And so almost every scenario here, heat pumps will cut carbon. We go to the next slide. But starting today is actually even better. So this is with a grid that includes the closure of Indian Point. So this is like today's grid. And we see that even heat pumps that operate at least at a coefficient of performance of 2 will also reduce emissions. So it's really something we should start to do today and take action. Our grid is good enough right now to be installing heat pumps. Next slide. So now we come to the grid piece of this. And so over the last 2 years, we heard these kinds of questions that, if my building is going to need an electrical upgrade, shouldn't the grid also get a capacity upgrade? And, I know that the grid is strained during the summer, so why should we push it harder? And finally, what would happen to an all-electric building if we had a winter blackout? So let's talk a little bit more about those. First and foremost, we looked at NYSO Zone J. So NYSO is the New York Independent System Operator, and that's really how they quantify New York City. We're Zone J. And we just looked at the monthly peaks over the last decade. And so we saw a monthly peak in July that's typically around 11,000 megawatts. And then we saw a peak in January that's around 8,000. So there's about 3 gigawatts separating those two. There's a lot of room for growth at the city level. And on top of that, when it's hot outside, it actually makes it harder to deliver really high loads. And that's why we actually do get a grid that's stressed out in the summer, because we're pumping out a lot of juice to serve air conditioners, but it's also really hot for the equipment to be delivering that power. So that's not the whole story, though. So we have to go a level deeper. And Con Edison actually divides New York City into 70 different areas. These are called the network areas, and they have all the underground equipment, cables and transformers. Each of these zones, you'll see the map on the right, and I apologize, I didn't have room to include Staten Island, but I really wanted to get a close-up look at Manhattan. Each of these areas peaks in summer between 50 megawatts and 500 megawatts. So huge differences between these different networks. But we found that all of them could add at least 20% to their winter load without exceeding capacity. So we have a lot of what's called available headroom. Next slide. Now, what does that mean at the building level? So for your typical multifamily, this is a pre-war multifamily low-rise, your monthly use looks like it does on the left here. So that's a lot of natural gas, peaks in January, and just a little bit of electricity use. What we're looking to is switching to the graph on the right. So this is actually looking at a January day from midnight to midnight. Today's electrical use is the gray baseline on the bottom. When we install heat pumps, nothing else, no efficiency, no storage, we get that orange curve that peaks at 4 watts per square foot in the morning, and then it falls down to a valley around 1 watt per square foot in the afternoon. So that's a really difficult load curve to serve. We want to avoid that. We want to install things like roof insulation and new windows and big hot water tanks so that we can flatten out that demand curve throughout the day. So I'll give you a little bit more detail on that one. Keep going. So the first thing we want to do is make sure we can time when the heat pumps that serve domestic hot water are running. So we want to do that in the early morning while people are still sleeping, and then allow them to discharge the hot water tanks for that early morning rush. You can see that happens in the gray portion below the graph. And then we recharge those tanks while people are at work, or at least they're not taking showers. And then we have our tanks recharged for the evening bath time. And then if we layer on top of that the next piece, which is the heating, again, our heating loads are probably going to be highest in the midnight to 6 a.m. range where it's very cold. And so we're going to need some battery storage to offset some of that so that we don't get an extremely high peak in the early morning hours. And then next slide, if we layer it all together, you can see the dotted line is what we had before the efficiency and storage. And then that levelized peak is how all those different end uses fit together. And we fit the jigsaws so that we can create a flat line of power consumption. Next slide. So this makes all the difference between just electrifying, just putting in heat pumps into all of our buildings, versus what we call smart electrification, which is including things like roof insulation, weatherization, battery storage, thermal storage. We could either be peaking at 15 gigawatts tomorrow, the green curve, which is just 38% above today's summer peak, or we could be doubling power demand citywide, which would really be unmanageable over the next decade or two. Next slide. So when could this occur? We didn't take a stab at the actual year. A lot of other smart folks throughout the state have done this already. So the Climate Action Council thinks that New York State will have a winter peak by 2035. NYSO thinks that Zone J will happen a year earlier. You can see some of that data on the right. And when I say winter peak, all I mean is that we're going to have our peak power demand occur in January rather than July, because we're not trying to meet up with the demand of air conditioners anymore. We're trying to meet the demand of heat pumps pushing heat into our multifamily and office buildings. Next slide. So to give you a sense of when this might occur, or at least how much market penetration we would need to see this winter peak, what I'm showing here are all the bands of smart electrification. And today we have on the bottom the power demand curve for the entire city. And then each green increment is 10% of the building area citywide. And so you go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, somewhere between 40% and 50% of the city would have to be electrified before we exceed the current summer peak demand. Now, for context, fewer than 1% of our buildings are electrified today, so that's a long way away. The other piece of this is, where would it occur? So what we did was we also created these maps that show zip code by zip code and network area by network area where we think the winter peaks are going to occur first. Somewhat surprisingly, we found that the outer borough neighborhoods are going to flip first. So like the East Bronx, Crown Heights, Jackson Heights, these are the places where we have a lot of low-rise residential buildings, and we also have low summer peaks today. Next slide. Now, just because you have a winter peak doesn't mean you've overwhelmed your grid. And so you have to, again, look at the network areas and look at the different scenarios. So these are showing electrification alone on the left, efficient electrification with insulation, weatherization in the middle, and on the right, smart electrification. So you can see if we just do heat pumps, even at 40% electrification, we're going to kind of overwhelm Brooklyn and the Bronx with a lot of demand. And you can go ahead and explore all this data on your own if you go to maps.urbangreencouncil.org. Really cool interactive map that we've designed. And with that, next slide, I'll just say thank you to our sponsors for making all this research possible, Energy Foundation and NYSERDA. And I'd like to hand it off to Nicole. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. My name is Nicole Bean, and I work on legislation at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. And I'm going to go over some of the details of the law that New York City passed to mandate some of the work that we've been talking about today. So Local Law 154 was passed by the City Council and signed by the former mayor in December of last year. And you can see the gas-free NYC sign, which was the coalition that Sonal was a part of. We worked really closely with advocates on this. Oh, can you not hear me?
It's okay. I can hear you okay. If you can maybe just try to move the mouthpiece a little bit closer.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think just try to speak up a little. I can hear you well.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. So the Local Law 154 was passed by the City Council and signed by the mayor in December. The law prohibits the on-site combustion of high-emitting substances in new construction. The requirement is phased in, beginning with small buildings in 2024, and buildings over 7 stories must comply beginning in July of 2027. You can go to the next slide. So there are a few exceptions to the law, including buildings that are used for the generation of electric power or steam, manufacturing, laundromats, hospitals, commercial kitchens, and emergency or standby power. There are a couple of other exceptions listed there, and they're all to the extent necessary and in the space that is occupied by the use that's accepted. Go to the next slide, please. The requirement is only for new construction, but some renovations rise to the level of new construction for the purposes of construction document approval. And those buildings will need to meet new building requirements, which also means complying with this law, with Local Law 154. And this is explained in further detail in the buildings bulletin that is referenced on this slide to understand which renovated buildings will have to comply as new buildings for purposes of this law. Actually, I think you can skip the next slide because Sonal and Sean covered the justifications quite well. So we can go to the next one. So this law will be enforced by the Department of Buildings when they review and approve construction documents. And there are programs to support building owners and developers in complying with the law. And Mike will go over some of these in more details later, but we have PACE, the New York City Accelerator program, which is putting this talk on today, and the Clean Heat program, which Sean talked about a little bit earlier. You can go to the next slide, please. The bill also required several studies of my office, of the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, including a study about heat pump technology and the feasibility of the use of heat pumps in large buildings. And that will include the cost of, based on the building size and the cost of both the installation and the use, as well as the environmental impacts of the technologies. You can go to the next slide, please. And the second study is a look into the reliability and the resiliency of the city's electrical distribution grid and transmission lines, which lots of groups have been doing a lot of work on, and Sean explained some of Urban Green Council's work on this, but our office will be completing another study on this. And now I'll ask Mike Berry to talk a little bit about the accelerator and resources that are available to buildings.
Thanks, Nicole. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure today to be able to speak to you about the New York City Accelerator and the technical resources and assistance available that we will be able to provide you to meet the challenges of Local Law 154. Next slide. The New York City Accelerator is a program to provide assistance for local law compliance to help increase energy savings while reducing carbon emissions across New York City's buildings. The Accelerator provides free technical assistance while helping to identify pathways to highlight the benefits and addressing some of the barriers that Sean discussed earlier to comply with local laws like 154. The Accelerator also provides and will connect building decision makers with service providers that can help with your decarbonization needs on your projects. And lastly, as Nicole just mentioned, I think where we're going to be the most helpful for some folks is helping to identify those applicable financial incentives and financing options like the New York City Accelerator PACE financing offer. Next slide. So any privately owned building in New York City over 5,000 square feet, whether it's new or existing, can participate in the accelerator. How you get involved is you just call us. We'll have one of our dedicated account managers work with your project and your project team to identify what resources and technical assistance you need, and also try to work with your teams to figure out what kind of financial incentives that might be applicable to your projects. The best part of this, there's no catch, there's no cost, there's no sign up, there's no commitment. All you have to do is call us. We're here to help. We're looking to provide assistance and help overcome any barriers or challenges with local laws like 154. Next slide. Coming soon, we'll be providing technical trainings and resources on local law 154. These will be hosted on our website. Our website link is on this slide. And I know we're making this slide deck available after the presentation. We're going to be providing trainings. We'll have a training page dedicated to trainings focused on local law 154, with our first training coming up on small buildings less than 7 stories. And this will be a heat pump training to assist with local law 154. Also on our training page will be the New York City Accelerator's Learning Center. This is a free to use learning center with over 30 plus courses, with more being added hopefully daily or at least weekly. These courses will be able to be taken in your time at your leisure. Once you get your credentials, you can log in, you can take the trainings. These trainings are on different building practices, new technologies. There's some soft skill trainings. There's trainings that have CEUs attached to them for AIA, BPI, and also NEAT. With some additional certifications coming on as well. These trainings are offered through the accelerator and will be hopefully being posted in the next couple of weeks, so please check in. Also on our website, we're going to be adding in links to our partners in the city who offer trainings. So this is NAFAN, NYSERDA, BX, Urban Green Council. These links will be available and we'll bring you to their sites, and we'll also be able to provide training and technical assistance for things like local law 154. Also, we're excited to have on our website technical resources. These technical resources will be able to address things like local law 154, but we'll also be able to provide things like a variable refrigerant flow guideline. There'll be a primer on local law 97. We're looking to put on case studies that would be able to show different buildings in the city that are being built today to these standards, and they could include things like a passive house case study. But more importantly, I think we're very excited to put on, and I think will be very helpful, our playbooks, and these playbooks will be focused on multifamily and commercial buildings and how to meet or exceed local law 154. So please check in, and we'll hopefully have those posted soon. But we're really excited to have these technical and training resources available. Next slide. So the New York City Accelerator has a new building offer. This is for new construction projects over 5,000 square feet. Account managers will be available to provide technical assistance and training resources to your building teams. This is to help with things like addressing local laws, but hopefully also talking about above code construction. We're also looking to encourage building teams and building projects to incorporate new technologies like heat pumps, VRFs, green roofs, solar. We're also looking at helping to promote new building practices like passive house. But again, one of the things that we think we're going to be most helpful and most beneficial to building teams is the identification of financing and incentive programs through NYSERDA, the New York Accelerator PACE financing that we've been hearing about that has a new construction offer for buildings being built to all electric. And that just was released just recently. So we're very excited to get that out and assist people with that program offer. And then the New York State Clean Heat Program, with working with our partner Con Edison, making incentives available for heat pump technologies to comply with the New York State Clean Heat Program, which Sean talked about. I think probably one of the benefits for participating in the new buildings offer is that we want to promote your project. We want to recognize it. So we have a recognition program coming out in May of 2022 that will be looking to identify buildings and building teams that are building cutting edge buildings in the city, incorporating some of these new technologies and building practices, maybe building buildings today that are all electric that would exceed local law 154 or 97. We want to recognize these buildings. We want to have a point of reference in the city where we can show that this is being done and applaud you for your hard work. With that, before I hand it off, we are going to provide a link to participate in the New York City Accelerator. Again, this is a free program. We hope that you'll reach out to us for technical assistance, whether you're your new building, your existing building, but we're here to help, so please reach out. With that, I will hand the slides over for questions with my colleagues. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all of our speakers today. So you can come back on camera and we'll start addressing the Q&A. All right. So, Sean, I saw there was a question for you. Did you analyze a bad electrification scenario, such as electric resistance only?
Good question. So we did not. And keep in mind, our study covered existing and new construction. So to put electric resistance into an existing building would be extremely difficult. And that's because the electrical capacity upgrade you'd have to do that would be extremely expensive. But on the new construction side, obviously we assumed heat pumps as well. So that's a long answer, short answer of no. But my sincere hope is that electric resistance is not part of our all-electric future. And I think a lot of that will be avoided because it's so costly on the operational side, and also because it's carbon intensive. It would make it difficult to comply with local law 97.
Thank you. And I believe you responded to this question already, but the studies there was a question from Lauren Hildebrand. Is this data just for air source heat pumps? What about ground source? I believe you addressed that in your presentation, but just wanted to clarify.
Okay. Yeah, good clarifying question. So we only looked at air source heat pumps. In the study, you can see some of the coefficients of performance and systems that we assumed. So in one way, it could only get better if we actually do some ground source heat pumps. We also did not look at transportation. So electric vehicle charging is not part of our study. That's additional research that should be done.
Great, thank you. All right, I saw another interesting question in here. Just looking through the chat. There was a question, Mike, about if NYC Accelerator is available to long-term lessees.
Sorry, I was trying to get myself off mute. Yes, I believe so. I can also follow up after this call, but I do believe that long-term lessees, we've worked with projects already that have 99-year ground leases on projects, and work directly with different building partners and stakeholders in projects. So yes, please reach out to us and we're here to help you.
Thank you. There was also a question about backup generators for these buildings when the lights go out in the grid.
Yeah, that's a good point. I did not touch on that one because we don't have a great answer yet. But obviously in new construction, you're going to have to adhere to the energy code. So your envelope's going to be much better. It's going to be a good place to shelter in place at least for a day or two, and hoping that the outage is short. In terms of backup power, I will also just mention that almost all of our heating systems today require power to operate. So if the power goes out, your furnace or boiler will probably not be able to circulate heat in the building because it doesn't have fans and pumps. Granted, yes, if you have enough backup power to just do those fans and pumps, then you could ignite your boiler and actually have heat. So that is a significant difference. And I think there's some ways to go in terms of making all electric buildings more resilient.
Great, thank you. Another great question here from Matthew. What role will reducing demand in our buildings play in this equation to make it easier on both the next generation of heat pumps and the grid?
I'm sorry, it's probably a little more difficult to hear me now that I'm wearing a mask as well. But so I think the question sort of answers itself, right? Of course, reducing demand is going to make everything easier as we move forward. I don't know if Sean or Mike have more specific thoughts on it, but yes, reducing demand is a big part of this.
Yes. So a lot of I have more detailed slides, or you can, contact me if you have any questions about the Grid Ready report. But we really are advocating for all these efficiency and storage options to be included in some of these electrification upgrades. And for new construction, it should be part of the plan in an integrated design, because we really can't be oversizing heat pump systems to fit into our city. We've got to make sure that the demand is manageable. And even though the grid can accommodate incremental electrification, there's going to have to be upgrades along the way. So Con Edison is constantly upgrading cables underneath our streets, and you're going to see a lot more of that as we see more heat pumps come online.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I would also just add is, to Sean's point, is that if you have a project, get hold of us as early as possible. We'd like to get in before you finalize your plans. We can look at through your plan set, your schematic design, make recommendations, and yeah, I mean, as early as we can, great. But if you also have a project that's under construction and you're just looking for us to review and make recommendations on what may have benefited that project, so on future projects we can apply those. We're really looking at shell measures and making sure that buildings are really as efficient as possible. So we're really looking to kind of help push beyond code. But yeah, please reach out with any projects. And again, even if your project's already under construction, we'd still like to talk to you, because we do have areas of construction we're looking to explore all the way through commissioning. So anything we can do to help, please reach out.
And this is a question for Nicole. Will Local Law 154 allow the use of natural gas in processes that do not use combustion, such as fuel cells?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, we'll have to talk more with DOB about implementation of the law.
Thank you. Another question for Mike. Can or does NYC Accelerator provide a building with an estimate of fines that would be potentially a result of the CMA?
Yes, I believe so. Again, I'm more focused on the new building side, but please reach out to us. And I do know that we are working with both existing buildings and new buildings, looking at potential laws and the impacts, fines on those buildings.
And I'll just mention that there are quite a few tools out there in the public and private sector to do that estimation. It's based on the benchmarking data. obviously nobody can certify what fine you're going to have or even what your emissions will be in 2024. So you got to kind of take it with a grain of salt and understand what you're looking at.
Yeah, and I think to that point too, we've said that with even looking at buildings for a local law 97 compliance for 2030 or 2050, you know, we can help buildings prepare themselves to hopefully meet or exceed it, but we can't guarantee that. But what we're looking at is to future-proof these buildings and look for ways that when the time comes that maybe you don't have to take such a hit on your buildings to retrofit them.
Great. And I think, Mike, the response is yes, our account managers on the existing building side can certainly help identify the fines. We'll work on that.
Thanks, Natasha. I should probably have known that, but I've been heads down on new construction, so I apologize. And I'm also very new to this program, as the offer itself is fairly new as well.
Yes, thank you. And there's a question here about how do heat pumps compare to how do heat pumps / electrification compare to solar?
They're really two different technologies. One is trying to collect energy and then allow you to use that electrical energy for whatever purpose you want, whatever end use. Whereas a heat pump is really something that needs electricity to run, and primarily the heat pump is just going to be collecting heat from the outside air or some other resource, and then bringing it inside, either to heat up your living room or to heat up water for you to shower. So, you know, you could pair solar PV systems with heat pumps. Obviously, that comes with a lot of logistical challenges on top of electrification already.
Thank you. Another question that came in, what are the requirements for demand-controlled ventilation based on the current NYC Energy Code and where the Energy Code is likely to go from here?
I think the best thing for the questioner to do would be to reference the ASHRAE standard. I believe it's ASHRAE 62, to take a look at some of the ventilation requirements for different building types. And that'll be your best source of detailed technical information on ventilation.
We are looking through the accelerator to put together a one page, or it might even be a videoed essentially cell sheet on ventilation, looking at ASHRAE 62.2. We're in the process of working on that, as we know that ventilation and indoor air quality is definitely something that's high on people's lists now, and how the intersection of that and performance of the buildings coexist. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of these resources are still in development and coming out soon, but we hope to have something shortly on that.
Great, thank you. I see there's a question from Lav here, who is a property owner of an aging rent stabilized building. I think you provided a really great comment, but I believe we should take that conversation offline. So we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar. Thank you for sharing that information in the chat. Question here from Sunitha. Are there any fines associated with buildings not complying with Local Law 154 once it goes into effect?
So the way that implementation is going to work is that the Department of Buildings will look at the plans of the building as they approve construction documents. And so it doesn't seem likely that there'll be fines, it's just that your construction documents won't get approved. If there's like some way that you're not complying with the law and faking construction documents, then yes, there'll be fines associated with that. But it doesn't seem like the most likely path as considering the implementation process.
Thank you. And question here about what financial assistance besides financing is available to upgrade building electrical systems? Oh, I think the question changed right as I was reading it. So I think we highlighted, I can go back a slide. I think we highlighted a couple of available incentives.
Yeah, and I just point out these are just examples of some of the incentive and finance options and programs out there. The best thing I could say is if you have a specific project or you're getting ready to do a project, reach out to the team and we can work with you. Your account manager that would be assigned to your project would be able to identify any applicable incentive programs. And we're really trying to also look like far and wide. My own background, I did work prior to coming into this job. I did work in the affordability sector. And so we used to look for a lot of programs that are available beyond local, state, utility, even federal programs through HUD. There's definitely some home rehabilitation programs. So again, the best I can say is reach out and we can talk about your project and see what we can identify.
And I'll mention the NYSERDA Buildings of Excellence competition again. That's a perfect place to go look for funding for your all-electric building. And the other thing is that in our research, we identified this weakness that there weren't actually a lot of incentive programs covering specifically electrical capacity upgrades. And so we're advocating to expand some of the electrification incentive programs to cover that as well as heat pumps.
Thank you. And another question that came through, have there been retrofits of hydronic systems using modulating chillers?
I do not know of one, but I know that that is an innovative idea that some of the big engineering firms in the city are proposing, but I don't know of one.
I unfortunately don't know one either, but we would be interested to find out if anyone on today's presentation has or worked with one of those. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear how that went.
And an interesting question came in. How do we solve the issue of finding space and locations in older buildings for the new equipment? Have environmental, well, take the first part of that question.
Yeah, in existing buildings, this is a big issue. And one of the ways that we approached it was to say, if we're going to electrify buildings in New York City with air source heat pumps, it probably means that rooftop solar has to take a side seat to the electrification of heating and hot water. So that was the big piece of it. And I know that there's been some experimentation with different places to put the outdoor units. So along some of the side walls and the alleyways of buildings, building out additional structures in the back where there may have been stairwells before, as well as things like if you have existing PTAC openings, there are new products that can fit into that opening and basically be your pathway to electrifying.
Thank you. I think we have time for about one or two more questions. Question came in, will new construction single-family residences need to abide by these updates?
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So to be clear, the law is only for new construction, which is in this question, but I didn't know if it was clear in the previous question. And new construction single family residences will be in the first wave of this phase in for the law. And so small buildings will have to be built without the on-site combustion of fossil fuels beginning in 2024. So yes, and soon.
Great. And then I think just maybe one final question. Does electric resisting heating comply with Local Law 154?
Sean?
Yes, it does. So that is something that's not directly addressed in Local Law 154. But as I mentioned, it's going to be prohibitively costly to operate a building that is entirely resistance heating. And it's also going to have a lot of trouble complying with Local Law 97. So it wouldn't be a smart decision of a developer to go ahead and do that today. Also, there's going to be another cycle of the energy code before 2027. And so there's an opportunity to look at how we can limit the use of resistance to only the places where it's really needed, rather than the whole building.
Great, thank you. Well, we're coming up on time. Are there any final words of advice or any final resources any of our panelists would like to highlight before we close out?
I would say please reach out to the Accelerator if you have the Accelerator. If you have any projects, any questions, we're here to help. And yeah, thank you for joining. We had quite a turnout today.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. And this is an achievable future. So we can do this. It's been shown that we can do it for heating, and we're starting to show we can do it for hot water too.
Thanks so much for joining.
Yeah. So I'm seeing questions. Yes, absolutely. We will be distributing a link to this webinar shortly, later this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you would like to get in touch with NYC Accelerator, please visit us online, email us at info@accelerator.nyc, or give us a call at 212-656-9202. Have a great day, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Bye, everyone.